All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third session of the day of the Contemporary Artist Book Conference. My name is Karina Reynolds. I'm the Executive Director of Center for Book Arts and also a member of the CABC Planning Committee. I will be the moderator for this session. And before we begin, I just want to thank all of you for attending today and also to thank our sponsors, Deirdre Lawrence, who's been a longtime supporter of CABC, as well as the Grolier Club. The title of this year's conference is Artist Books as Expanded Literacy. And through the various panels and sessions over today and tomorrow, and in our keynote, which happened earlier last week, we are continuing to explore this question of how artist books can expand upon ideas of information and visual literacy. This panel today specifically discusses the topic of material literacy. It's something that I'm particularly interested in. And so our format for the day is going to be pretty straightforward. I'll start off by introducing both of our panelists. They will each present, and then we will have discussion and a Q&A portion afterwards. Throughout the talk, feel free to add your questions into the chat, and I will read them out loud for the panelists during the Q&A portion of the program. So our first presenter is Honglan Huang. Honglan received her PhD in comparative literature at Yale University. Her dissertation project focuses on books as sites for material encounters and embodied performance. She was also a participant in the Chicago Puppet Lab, and she has created and performed a number of puppetry pieces that explored mental processes such as reading and memory and self-reflection, all of which are topics that I think come up quite often in the book arts. Our second speaker for this session is Nishra Ranpura. Nishra is an interdisciplinary designer, researcher, and creative technologist. Her work explores the interactions between the physical and the digital through experimental and speculative narratives. She researches, practices, and teaches across the disciplines of new media, digital fabrication, and in addition to that, she uses creative technology and design research. The way that she puts it is essentially that she makes things and breaks things. And sometimes she writes, and oftentimes she wonders. So please give a warm welcome to both of our panelists, and in particular to our first presenter, Honglan.
Thank you, Karina, for the introduction, and I'm so happy to be sharing my work with you today. So my talk today is about how performance can help us understand reading. I would like to begin with this opening page from Holdup, which is very different from what we usually expect of a book page. It is almost blank. There are no words to read and no images to behold, only two green lines that carefully mark the area where the reader should place her thumbs on each side when holding up the book. As I slip my thumbs inside the encircled area and wait, I notice the paper's edge brush against my skin. I register the gentle weight of the book on my palms, and I discover the symmetry of the double spread, mirroring my own symmetrical body. From its opening spread, the book insists on making itself tangible to the reader and making the reader newly aware of herself. By asking the reader to read with both eyes and hands, and to consider the material book not merely as a container for meaning, but as a source of meaning, Holdup curates a reading experience that challenges how reading is conventionally described. Here, reading does not mean to excavate. or to penetrate the material surface of the page so as to unearth the virtual narrative beneath, as Seymour Chapman suggests. The book size and the page's thickness are meant to be read as an integral part of the text, rather than as a paratextual layer that, following Gérard Genette's metaphor, temporarily close the text. The book does not seek to overcome the material situation of reading, to conjure in the reader's mind a world more vivid, dynamic, and rich in sensory details, as Eileen Scarry describes. Instead, it creates its own world comprising the conventional reading practice of holding, the silent blank space, the rectangular shape of the open spread that keeps the thumbs at the margins. The material book is not distractive, but conducive to the reader's immersion in this world that includes her eyes, fingers, arms, and breath. Moreover, the surface of the book is not as still as it seems. If we connect the two green lines to the dedication, for voyeur of all ages on the previous page, they become imbued with tension. Is the book truly unaware of the reader's gaze if it can anticipate the reader's touch? Does the reader remain a voyeur of the book even if parts of her body are inside the pages? Holdup invites us to imagine its material form not as the threshold at which the movements of the text come to a halt, as Roland Barthes envisions, but rather as an interface through which the rippling motions of the text can be felt. The book, though seemingly finite, visible, and static, generates plurality and tensions. Books like Holdup ask for a new way of approaching reading that addresses it as both physical practice and mental act, and which therefore involves negotiating between material and virtual. Such books push us to imagine reading as more than translating signs into meanings or words into hallucinated images. How does the material book make reading's fundamental operations visible to us? How does the embodied experience of reading teach us to think conceptually about reading as a dynamic tensile process? My work addresses these questions through a methodology I call reading as experimental performance. This approach helps us understand both reading's phenomenological complexity and its potential to transform and reinvent itself. Performance provides us with a method of thinking about the liminal, the co-present, and the relationship between the virtual and the embodied, and so help us unpack reading's inherent duality. Seeing reading through the lens of performance lets us explore what it means to shuttle between inside and outside of a text, to move between imagining and perceiving, to negotiate between closing in on choices and keeping possibilities open. Most often, reading is discussed as a kind of standardized performance. To read is to comprehend, and when the reader is literate and competent, reading unfolds smoothly without calling attention to itself as every new word appears. Yet for reading to become experimental performance, the reader needs not only literacy and competence, but also artistry and aesthetic awareness. It is about how to make reading appear in all of its phenomenal density, rather than perfecting the technique so that reading happens more and more smoothly. Emphasizing reading as experimental performance rather than a conventional one, I want to highlight how reading becomes especially tangible when the material book, beyond simply offering us a story, asks us to pay attention to how we read, where we place our thumbs, how our muscles respond to the weight of the book, and what kind of gaze we lay upon the pages. In other words, reading becomes more itself in cases that call attention to its constitutive processes. This reciprocity makes it possible for us to experiment and to explore alternate ways of turning a page, and the embodied experience helps us understand how reading makes transformations happen through its duality and dialogic nature. Now I'd like to return to Holdup to show how reading as experimental performance works in practice. A few pages into the book Holdup, One of the thumbs suddenly turns to address the reader directly and delivers the following speech. There is no real rush, of course. We're not in a hurry to go anywhere. But if you turn over a new leaf every now and then, you can help us thicken the plot. There is a plot, you know, and you're part of it. Yes, everything's a plot, and all the world's a page, as they say. So, whoever you're out there, be a nice warrior and turn the page. Thank you. Here, the thumb adapts the classic all the world's a stage trope to talk about its own world. The page is literally what this world is made of, but this small world made of paper and ink also resembles that of a stage. The open spread is a deliberately framed space like that of the stage. Pairs of thumbs arrive and leave. They come from all walks of life. Even the reader's thumbs are invited to join. The green lines around the page corners are like spike marks, indicating where the reader's thumb should position themselves when performing. Lines of speech flow next to the one speaking, along with stage directions in parentheses. At the same time, this small world of the book is quite unlike any typical theater. The reader simultaneously watches and performs. The stage is small enough to be held in hands, and actions take place only along its edges. The book is both a fellow performer and a script held in the actor's hand. By mixing page and stage, Holdup creates an experimental space where we learn about reading by using our hands and where we practice performing through engaging with paper and ink. It not only reminds us of the necessary acts our body performs to make reading happen, but also invites us to practice holding, turning, weight shifting as embodied ways of thinking about reading and performing. In the second spread, where the printed thumbs make their first appearance, we immediately perceive that the two sides are visually different. The left thumb is brighter and delivers more texture, while the right thumb is covered by pockets of deep shadows. The text floating above each thumb reads, "Here we are again, the first to arrive as always," says the thumb on the left, quite assertively. "And, as always, we're not alone," the thumb on the right replies, on a slightly more cautious note. The two thumbs perceive the spread differently. The left thumb sees the spread as a hermetically sealed space. The page is a world other than itself, and the right thumb is its only interlocutor in this world. The right thumb, however, can see beyond its own dimension and take into account the material reality of the whole reading situation. The reader's thumbs are as alive to it as their two-dimensional partners made of shades of black ink. One leads us into the world within the page. The other reflects attention back at ourselves. Here, it is the double spread, a paper structure meant to be held in hand, that make reading's duality tangible to us. The reader is not either merged into the world of the book or alienated. Rather, holding up the double spread trains the reader to inhabit both modes of perceiving and to experience reading as continuous shuttling between outside and inside. Reading in Holdup is particularly dense and complex because reader is always doubly cast, the audience and the performer, the puppet and the puppeteer, both at the same time. The trickiness of performing such illusion becomes most apparent a few pages into the book. Here, the thumbs lined up at the bottom suddenly begin what the top thumbs consider as a serious discussion. The subject of the discussion is none other than the relationship between the voyeur reader and the plot. Do the voyeur's thumbs really stay where they should be? Does the plot have enough power to keep them there? What if the voyeur's hands no longer obey the plot and turn to exercise their right to slam us shut, rip us apart, give us to a sick friend, slop coffee all over us, dog-ear us, leave us on the subway, burn us, drop us in a puddle, plagiarize us, censor us, deface us, sneeze on us, bury us on a shelf, break her backs, wipe his ears with us, lend, borrow, or steal us, warp us, fall asleep on us, review us, or, God forbid, even recycle us, the thumbs wonder. Here, the reader and the book, like a puppeteer and puppet both visible on stage, are two self-conscious lives powered by the same body. The life of the printed thumbs depends on their paradoxical separateness from and connection to the reader. The more the book and the reader oppose and contradict, the more visible the tension and the more distinct and live each becomes. The reader has to hold the tension not only between herself and the book, simultaneously worried and satisfied about the fact that one is fully at the mercy of the other, but also between two competing ontological realities. On one level, the voyeur reader is the one who has total control over the situation. On another level, however, the book only feigns losing control. By imagining what it's like to go off script, the reader is already following what has been scripted. The more the thumbs are conscious of their fate as printed figures on a page, the more alive they become than ever before. The more the book reminds us of its bookishness, it is not waterproof, it can be carried and passed around, it opens and closes, it can be folded, it is made of paper, the more it transforms the page into a world. To perform this scene effectively, the reader needs to learn how to inhabit one reality without completely losing sight of the other, and to see the opposites as generative rather than forces that cancel each other out. Holdup, to some extent, is like a theater exercise. It asks questions like, how many different relationships can you have with the book by just holding and looking at it? Can you vary the intensity of any of those relationships and let them evolve over time? Can you find different ways of transitioning between holding and turning? How do you commit to choices on one page, yet always ready for a different take when the page is turned? In this theater exercise, the book is more than just an actorial aid that keeps the performance fresh and tensile at every step. It is also a second body that helps model an immersive, reflexive attention towards our own performance. Towards the end of the book, the two thumbs closest to the gutter at the bottom ask us to notice what holding feels like to our own thumbs. The thumb on the left says, "You know, I've slowly reached the conclusion that there are a lot more pages on my side of the book than on your side." To which the one on the right replies, of course there are." As the thumbs suggest, reading is about not only seeing how things shift visually within the frame of the spread, but also feeling how the book's weight gradually transfers between our two hands. The thumbs play it back to us. The physical act of reading that we often look past is a reading lesson in itself. Even though the act of holding may look the same from the outside, so specifically scripted with almost no room for interpretation, micro adjustments happen in the muscles as they respond to every subtle change caused by the weight shift. The simple act of holding up becomes different actions from spread to spread, both virtually and physically. The reader holds up to endure the confinement of her thumbs to the enclosed area, to feel tempted by the idea of overlapping her thumbs on top of the other thumbs, to consider the flat printed thumbs alongside with her own thumbs made of flesh and bones, to stay in each spread and delay the book from reaching its end, and to keep negotiating between these different roles. Now, before we leave the book for another text, Holdup reminds us that reading involves paying attention as much to what is inside a page as to what our own hands are doing. In this sense, holding up the book warms up the reader's hands to the gesture of writing and to the idea of reading as an interactive, experimental act. The printed thumbs are there to inspire the reader's thumbs to do likewise, shifting and adjusting, acting and responding, perceiving every detail of what's happening while imagining what is still emerging. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honglan. Now I'm going to invite Nishra to come up into the spotlight.
Thank you, Karina, and thank you, Honglan. That was quite captivating. Okay, so for today's talk, we will be looking at some of the examples of interwoven narratives that will talk about textile tactility and the visual articulation of data and language. And so before we begin, let me start with revisiting Claudia Della Torres' keynote talk for this conference earlier this week, where she shares some insightful thoughts and examples on how a book may be so much more than the traditional codex format. A book may take any physical, oral, visual, or tactile form as it communicates information, whatever that may be. And I think Honglan gave a really great example of one of those ways you can experience a book. And this reminds me of George Cuvier thoughts in The Shape of Time, remarks on the history of things, where he says, the history of things is about material presences, which are far more tangible than the ghostly evocations of civil history. In this brief talk, we will look at some examples of how the materiality of woven textiles expresses information, whatever that information may be. It is well experienced by us all how textiles have the power to reflect generations of cultural, social, economic, and technological narratives through their motifs, materials, makers, and methods. But their intertwined roots with the world of computation give space to robust opportunities to not only evoke emotions, memories, and discourses, but essentially visualize the invisible worlds of myriads of data forms through multisensory and multidimensional outcomes. The greatest invention of the 19th century was the invention of the method of invention. A new method entered into life. In order to understand our epoch, we can neglect all the details of change, such as railways, telegraphs, radios, spinning machines, synthetic dyes. We must concentrate on the method itself. That is the real novelty. And so one such method I like to believe is the concept of a swatch book. For craftspeople, a swatch book is a material archive of their craft's experiences, inspirations, learnings, and yearnings. In addition to being a journal of their journeys, a swatch book acts as a database of all sorts of information for the craftspeople. Information that can be stored, exchanged, revisited, and even updated. And Richard Sennett in The Craftsman also touches upon this concept when he says, we are more likely to fail as craftsmen due to our inability to organize obsession than because of our lack of ability. So today, allow me to share some of the metaphorical and some quite literal swatches from my so-called swatch book on the subject of textiles materiality that talks about visual articulation of data and language. Some of these swatches that I'll be sharing are collected, and some of these are created. So let's look at the first one. The first metaphorical swatch I'm sharing here is Craftwork Studios Computer 1.0. Computer 1.0 seeks to pay homage to the forebearers of computer history. This is a striking representation of this digital ghost, a hand-woven cloth, with a program kinetic surface that brings to mind data, code, and communication infrastructure. Computer 1.0 seeks to function as a historical lens that shows how our relationship to computing technology has always been fraught with juxtaposed promises of utopian and dystopian futures. while the reality consistently finds itself somewhere in between. This installation, as put by the Kraftwerk Studio, reminds its onlookers that society has been grappling with a digital existentialism and the question of, are we better off, since the birth of programming itself? In this way, Computer 1.0 is the physical display of the eternally uncertain potential of technology. Kraftwerk is a multidisciplinary design and art studio that does a lot of similar such examples and explorations about nature of textiles and technologies through their installations, through storytelling, and through material-based research, where material acts as incredible conduit of conducting artist-based research. The next so-called swatch from my swatch book I'd like to go over is called Last Words. Last Words is about being able to physically feel and cathartically experience the final words shared in the text messages by someone that was very close to me, who suffered from and passed away from COVID-19 in isolation. Here, the binary nature of zeros and ones, or ups and downs, are the building blocks of both computation and weaving. And so here's some last text messages that were sent by that loved one from an isolated hospital room, are translated into the binary zeros and ones, and then they're woven into plain weaving interlacement of ups and downs, which gave a cathartic experience of experiencing those last messages, which is more tangible than something which is in front of the film screen that was sent because of distance. Some of the messages that are part of this particular swatch are the temperature. My temperature is 99.5 degrees. Took the medicine at 5 p.m. Just had lunch. It's all okay. There's no pain or uneasiness for me now. See you soon. Another example that I would like to go through is the one that is Text Draft, or Weaving with Text by Merve Mepa. It is a generative and interactive web page project that proposes to think together about the traditional fields of weaving and language to reveal alternative possibilities. It explores the transformation and preservation of memory and recording, imagining a symbiotic relationship between language and weaving systems. The project focuses on the role of weaving as a social cultural repository of memory and the metamorphosis of language created through weaving, especially by women throughout history. The core of this research is based on a centuries-old weaving algorithm called naming draft. The algorithm uses letters as threads that are orchestrated. The letters that you see up at the top, it is one of the old weaving techniques that orchestrate the weaving process. The letters are coded as threads. They intertwine within the structure of the weave and form the design draft. Beyond its technical facets, the project considers the transformative potential of weaving in the realm of gender roles. In line with technological advances catalyzing cultural change, the art of weaving is explored as a conduit for analogous social change. The project proposes an avenue for amplifying narratives and discourses of gender equality and social justice. Merve Mepa, whose project is displayed over here, explores such similar interactions between material forms and social discourses in the fields of handicrafts, productions, and practices, and does similar incredible work. And she's from Istanbul and enjoys working with the modes of production and technologies and handmaking. The parallels and patterns among language, weaving, and computation often bring me to another one of George Cuvier quotes. The occurrence of things is governed by our changing attitudes towards the process of invention, repetition, and discard. Without invention, there would be only stability. Without copying, there would never be enough of any man-made thing. And without waste or discard, too many things would outlast their usefulness. And on the same note of language and art, one of the conversations that was mentioned by Richard Sennett in his book, The Craftsman, talks about how the painter Edgar Degas is once supposed to have remarked to Stephanie Mallarmé, "I have a wonderful idea for a poem, but I can't seem to work it out." Whereupon Mallarmé replied, "My dear Edgar, poems are not made with ideas, they are made with words." And while this controversial conversation was a topic of further debate, I too attempted to explore how I feel about the statement, which is why in trying to contradict it, I looked into the idea of, are poems made with really made with words over ideas? And here the woven erasure utilizes the interlacement properties of weaving over a random page from the same book of Craftsman, and it curates an erasure poem through the gaps in the interlacement of weaving. The good material is, the good work is, the good order is, it's now. Went before was a working sketch, was a problem, was the tempted one that likely loses self, like the self. To know is to. And with our so-called swatches from this swatch book that I'm sharing with you all, as we start to move from the parallels between computation and weaving and towards the parallels between language and weaving, here is another example called light. The structural properties of textiles that make a fabric heavy, sheer, dense, texture, lightweight, through complex weaves, diverse materials, and missing yarns are explored here to represent the concept of light, the way we describe light and the words that we use them, such as shadows and highlights, and surface play, and reflections, and rays of lights that have been manipulated by all of these different structural explorations, material explorations, missing yarns from in between their weaving processes to create gaps. And going through all of these different worlds of words and expressions makes me think about how the built environment is one thing, and how the people dwell in it is another. And so the next swatch that I'm looking to share here is blur. Blur is a statement on transparency in our technological environments. More and more information is becoming invisible in the way that it is stored, processed, and operated without us actually having an idea of what is going on, how it's behaving, where it's going. Because the information is not tangible, but it is in the form of data and bytes and pixels. And this acts as a provocation, as a question that says, are the layers of protection and organization blurring our understanding of that information? And with this, the final swatch from the swatch book that I'm sharing with you all today is of neuroplastic fabrication through morphogenetic making. The swatch attempts to understand and experience data through process of weaving. Now, when I say morphogenetic making, it is a type of making where the practitioner engages in wayfaring, where encounters with material influences the decision and actions to where to take the design rather than a set framework. And that is how the design evolves over time, depending on how the material behaves. Here, the woven swatch for neuroplastic fabrication is my attempt to embody the fabric structure and its wear and tear, tension and fragility or rigidity along with it. So here, as you can see, half of the swatch is a reflection of data collections of my personal habits. In this instance, it is my screen time for certain activities with the colorful beads that you see representing certain data points. And they are distributed throughout the day, and they represent a basic data visualization. But for the other half of the fabric, because of how the beads have created an uneven structure of the fabric, I try to rectify the unstable fabric structure by adding the beads wherever the fabric needed them to be to become more stable, to become more structured. And once I did that, I reversed that process of, instead of representing my habits into data, I represented and converted data into my habits. It was a week of complete chaos. I would wake up in the middle, I had to wake up in the middle of the night because that was what the data wanted me to do for the fabric to be stable. But eventually it truly made me aware of the unbalanced habits I foster and how hard it is to iron out the wrinkles of the fabric in real life. And that makes me wonder about what kinds of lives one could lead if they follow the woven patterns and weaves. Which is why I suppose the Isaac Stern rule is apt here, that says the better your technique, the more impossible your standards. Because to quote Richard Sennett, it's to the absolutist in every craftsman, each imperfection is a failure. But to the practitioner, obsession with perfection seems a perception of failure. So this encourages having the flaws and the properties of the materials embody what it's supposed to be and what it's supposed to mean and express, rather than aiming for something which is perfection and aiming for something which is to the T. And so yeah, with this, this brings me to the conclusion of sharing of a small part of the swatch book that I collect on with the different interwoven narratives on textiles materiality and how they react with visual articulation and the data and the language. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishra. I'm going to, oh, there you are, ask Honglan to rejoin us. All right. And at this point in the program, I'd love to hear if either of you have questions or comments from each other now that you've had an opportunity to hear each other's presentations.
Yeah, I can go first. Yeah, I kind of hear a lot of echoes across the two presentation, especially I think when you were talking about kind of morphogenetic making, which I feel like, well, what I'm trying to describe, the experimental process of reading is kind of like that. And it's really inspiring now to have like more tangible textile metaphor to think about, like, what is tension? Does it mean to be stable? Like, does it mean to be like held by opposite forces? Yeah, and what does it mean to like to perceive and make use of fragility, which I also find really interesting. Yeah, and I want to kind of know more about the project called Last Words, and the kind of material and physical process of making that weaving. What was it like? What was it like to kind of moving from those texts on a kind of digital screen to kind of actual fiber in hands?
Of course. And I agree on your first note about having so many similarities. That was something I was thinking about along those lines too, and I would touch up on that more later on. But to address the question, yeah, with the Last Words, as I mentioned, it was around the time when things were very intense with the pandemic. There were no vaccines around, and governments, hospitals were not really certain about how to handle the situation. So it was rather difficult to say farewell to somebody you're so close with. And because I've always had this habit and experience of embodying all of these different processes, as you saw, even if they're digital, I've make it my own in embodied ways. So I thought that the most basic way to keep experiencing those messages, but also not really get too much focused on the craft and the technique, would be to do the very basic translation of over and under in a weaving, and which is also really a basic translation of ones and zeros in computation. And if, as some of you might know, computation was, of course, derived from one of the first jacquard looms. So it kind of made the process really cathartic, where I could let go of my old devices. I didn't have to keep my chats. And it was something which is more tangible for me, the messages and the conversation, without having it displayed. It was only something that I knew, unless somebody wants to spend time and translate it. So it felt more intimate, also in the process of making, but also something which I can have in front of me without it always being a sad thing, you know. But yeah, thank you for asking. But on my note of your initial point of finding a lot of similarities, I think something that I've been thinking about was how you're experiencing going through reading and performing the book again, as in, I'm thinking along the lines of repetition, and how does that experience change for you or evolve for you over time as you go through the same process over and over again? Do you notice new things? Do you experience things in a different way?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think it's like kind of tricky because on one hand, like is the repetition about doing it, and yet while kind of being able to perceive different things, or is it just about like a kind of routine repetition? I think especially kind of in performance, a lot of time there's emphasis on this like repetition to be able to kind of perform it again and again. And I think with printing too, there is this kind of thinking about, it's about like getting multiple copies and doing the repetition, but is the like how to make repetition itself as kind of just repeated ways of like defamiliarizing oneself from the conventions, and being able to always find something new to look for.
Yeah, I agree. I have similar experiences. Sometimes it's always new discoveries of new patterns for me, and other times it feels a little bit dissociating, because you're expecting something to come your way that you already know. So it's always the experience itself of repetition, when it repeats, is always like new and unexpected for me. Something else I was also thinking about is what are some of the similarities that you notice when you experience different books? Are there certain similarities that you can find connections with, especially since the way you experience books in your own specific ways?
You mean how do I make kind of connections across different books?
Mhm.
Yeah, I feel like I'm drawn to kind of the type of books that are that invite reading. Kind of usually it's from the outside, it looks just like a normal kind of reading behavior, but but it transforms reading at the same time. I think I'm kind of particularly drawn to those books that it kind of both cites the act of reading, but also transforms it in the process. And I feel like those are also like, I feel like in kind of different from kind of traditional metafiction when it will be like this book pretending to be another book. I think the books that I'm particularly drawn to, they're kind of hovering between things, like they're simultaneously a book and a stage. They're simultaneously a mirror and a book. And it's about like it's trying to hover in there, and then it help us kind of understand mirror differently, understand book differently, help us understand like stage differently. And it's this kind of hovering process that I feel very interested in. And I also was curious about the interlacing project that you talked about. Yeah, and I was kind of thinking about like, because there are so many gaps and the kind of in-betweenness. I wonder if you can talk more about like the process of interlacing, how it works, and what the experience was like.
Yeah, of course. Talking about any particular example or
Yeah, I think there was one work, was it the weaving with text? Was it that one? Or, oh, I think it's woven erasure. Yeah, with the
yeah,
inter.
I think that was more like um it started as an exploratory exercise for me, based on the words that I read about how people feel about poetry. And I've always enjoyed reading them, but I haven't really been part of poetry as somebody who would know a lot about the mechanisms or how it's made, or yeah, just what the world of what that world is. So I was interested in exploring that particular quote through the idea of how, in which different ways can ideas mean more than words, because one of the conversations that was mentioned was like, it's the words that make poems and not ideas. And I was like, let me experiment on that sentence and see how I feel about that. And of course, I kind of see a lot of things through the lens of weaving, interlacement, patterns, repeats. It's somehow has become inherent. So um, with weaving, when you work with a lot of different weaves, such as if it's alternate up and down weave, there's a lot of interlacement, a lot of gaps in between. Then there are certain weaves which are close knit together, and all of those things. So um, that is something that I always wanted to experiment with. And that actually, the video that was showed is actually one of coded digital platform where it automatically generates random set of wheels. So you can upload any text from your side and it will generate a random pattern of weave on it, and then it would get rid of the words that are covered by the yarns and maybe make a composition from the words that were made, and lets you explore the concept of erasure poetry through that practice. Yeah, so it's mostly my interest in understanding patterns and how they behave, and also my interest in like exploring that particular quote. And I think before we started, we were talking about how you came across this particular book to perform and such. So are there any other subjects, any other books that you're interested in experiencing the way that you did this one?
Yeah, I in my dissertation I also work on the first edition of Tristram Shandy. So it has lots of material features, but it's also kind of some hovering between page and stage. And I also work on kind of picture books, artist books crossovers. So one of my favorite is Susie Lee's Mirror. So it's the mirror doesn't literally appear in the book, and it's kind of using the symmetry of the double spread to help you see the mirror. And at one point, it's the page become totally blank. So it's also kind of asking us to think about like the symmetrical structure of the plot and what happens when there is a gap, kind of like we've been talking about, when there is invisible things as well as visible ones.
That's really interesting. I'd love to have a look at that. I mean, when you mentioned mirror in a book, it also made me think of different materials of paper that are being used. So a material that is reflective, that's something that is transparent, that's more of a glass than a mirror, and just the idea of how those materials would also behave in addition to words, placements, and your interaction with the pages.
Yeah, when you were talking about those, I was thinking a lot about paper, but also kind of screen printing, like what does get filtered through, what doesn't, and also like the circuit board, like how do you organize kind of pathways of information, like on something two-dimensional, but can also organize three-dimensionally. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So I figured I might jump in here quick and ask you both. I think we have time for one more question, which is I'm wondering how you understand material literacy differently now after learning about each other's explorations. Maybe Nishra, I can tap you to go first.
I think the process of embodiment is something that was definitely that was definitely on my mind every time I thought about the way Honglan was presenting and speaking, and not just the process of like embodied experience of how you're behaving and how you're interacting with the book, but also the incredible narrations that were done made me think of how I would read a book for myself, I would read a book for somebody else, I would read a book as a mental exercise, like mentally or out loud. And the whole made me aware of the whole idea of embodiment a little bit more, of how I'm interacting with the books a little bit more, and thinking about all the different details that are present, especially in non-traditional books, and what would have been the purpose of like their placements and all of those. So I think that is also something that I resonate with a lot, like the whole process of embodiment, because I personally also like experiencing things with myself, with my hands, even if something digital, I always figure out a way to like bring it to me, to my person. So that is something that I thought about a lot when Honglan was presenting, and which is why I also had like a lot of questions for her regarding that, like how is she experiencing all of these different books? What are the similarities? What are the differences? Because that's what's got me going.
Honglan?
Yeah, for me, I think Nishra's presentation kind of helped me think a lot about this kind of interval space between like the material and the digital or the virtual, and kind of like how do material tangible things help kind of conjure metaphors, and then help us think about things conceptually, and when do we really need to return to the hands, and to kind of activate new metaphors. Yeah, and a lot of things that kind of words like interlacing, interweaving, which I like to use, but I haven't like really thought about this kind of complexity and noticing like that I can conjure gaps as much as connections and like details that are like that were very enlightening.
Well, thank you so much. I really very much enjoyed both of your performances, presentations. I did see that one person asked in the chat if there is a link that we can share to a recording of one of your book performances. And if you do have one, I can send it out to the registrants at a later date if you like. And but I just want to say thank you so much, Honglan and Nishra. It was wonderful to hear your perspectives on material literacy and to learn more about your practice or practices. And I hope that you both, as well as everyone who is watching, will join us tomorrow for the last day of the conference. I'm putting in the chat right now the links to join tomorrow. Our first session starts at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and I think could be particularly interesting in relation to both of the talks that we just heard with literary works reimagined and thinking about the ways that books take on a new life, as well as many other things tomorrow. So thank you so much, Nishra, Honglan, and everyone who tuned in today. All right.
Thank you so much. Likewise. Thank you for
See you
having
later.
Yeah, thank you for having us.